Thank you for a very interesting debate. Not being a philosopher, it's quite interesting to hear the different um, how to say terms and discussions of the ideas. Tolerance in our time is, of course, a very contemporary issue, as you are addressing here. I also find that maybe in our time we have a lot of changes in a very fast-paced world, and that may be the reason why tolerance has become, or recognition, which I find is a very, very good term instead of based on your reasoning. But we have had so many fast-paced changes and so many migration issues and so many views that are sometimes silenced, that I find that some things like hate speech, for instance, if you look at the causality, the reason for why this happens, it may be much easier to address it in the correct way. Um, because what I find is that media, for instance, not always address the different realities that people find themselves living in. That's what we see in Sweden. And so hate speech or protests or very strong political views become a kind of a protest from some people, where they find that establishment or other societies or news outlets do not really address their reality, what they are seeing. So is tolerance or recognition the correct way to address this issue, or is it rather freedom of speech and a variety of news outlets, or a variety of how we write history more suitable? Because if we have a wide variety of describing the society and the reality that people are living in, maybe hate speeches and extremist views may not be so necessary, so to speak. I hope I made my point.
You want to answer? You can also answer questions.
Yes. So, I mean, it's hard to say this in a, I mean, to summarize it in you know in one point. But I think there's the problem is a question of to whom are you giving voice, and for what reason are you giving voice, right? Now, in the case of migration, it is particularly an embarrassing situation because the voiceless are also the ones who do not have political voice in the sense of franchise, right? So it makes the situation even more complicated, right? But it's clearly a question of to whom are you willing to give voice in the public sphere? And that is what it really turns on. And the fact that you have um, a media landscape that becomes biased towards, say, more urban situations vis-a-vis rural situations because it's hard to do reporting from elsewhere, etc. All these elements play into the kind of voice that we hear. And of course, that has a great impact on how we're viewing society. But I think that as some of these issues are being more debated, it has changed the perception of people. And I think that the very fact that people today, I think this was the last Eurobarometer, now perceive climate change to be a more pressing issue than migration might be an effect of the debate that has been going on migration.
Maybe slightly from a slightly different angle, I had to think of, I mean, two books. Like there's Ali Hochschild, "Strangers in Our Own Land." I think you know this probably. There's a lot of debate about Brexit,
Yeah.
and one way to answer this question. So I'm siding with those who say like we should listen to people in Northern England. Then why did they vote the way? Or there's another book by Justin Guest, "The New Minority," about white male working class people. He did a study on a place in Ohio somewhere, and I think northwest or northeast London. where you have like the English Defense League. You know these groups. I think that's also something your question brings up. And here, of course, the answer would not be, you know, just shut these people down. You know, so these are real constituencies in democratic London, and once in a while one should try to. I mean, that's the Labour Party and others. That's part of their constituency, and we have this all over. I mean, we have this in Germany. You know, people who feel disenfranchised. But that's different from, you know, online hate speech and, you know, the other case I mentioned. It's a different level, you know. Writing these, you know, Facebook posts about Renate Künast in Berlin, you know, that's a different thing. But we have to realize that in these fractured societies, some people feel they are not being listened to. And one way to respond is by being drastic in their voting behavior, in their language. And that's, I would very much take this seriously. And that's maybe one of the interesting things about Brexit. I mean, the UK will somehow survive this. Maybe not as the United Kingdom. But we have to look into what's going on in this society. Same with our societies.
Am I next?
But
At the first session on this European values series, there was one gentleman who repeated the very same question in the Q&A 3 times. And I would like to put it forward to you, because Volker, you just said rightly, there are some people out there who have just the feeling they're not being listened to, and they voice it in an angry, most angry way, sometimes even in a violent way. So the gentleman at the Goethe-Institut here, he said to the speakers, "Do you believe that we, both in Sweden and in Germany, that we have the right institutions, the right political players, the right structures? Do we possess a problem-solving capacity which is adequate to the challenges we're facing?" It's a yes or no answer. Thank you.
My answer to that is no, we do not.
probably not. It's a very general question. Probably not.
I think this is a question, you must be careful because you're sitting here today and what you can see today is a reality. But if you add another 10 or 20 years from now on, and with all the institutions, all the power, all the experience we are going to collect, it might be possible. It might be a yes. That is what I'm thinking. But we are in a mess. But you can get out of the mess if you're struggling, if you use your brains. If you hold the mic closer to your mouth. I think that.
I mean, I would say, maybe following up on what you said, I don't think there needs to be, a revolution or a violent rupture or the abolishment of democracy or something like that. So that would be one answer. So there's potential for peaceful transformation. Yeah, open society all the way along.
Can I just add a short thing to that? I think one of the problems is that we need to kind of update the toolkit we have for defending liberal democracy, right? And just going with the idea that, the parties will eventually fix that, and the judges will eventually fix that, etc., has been a very unhappy way to go about. And it requires a much more active citizenry if we are to make these institutions work properly.
Yeah, and then mm. And the other lady, she mentioned like it's a fast-paced society. You know, I mean, who would have imagined, again, being in Stockholm, Greta Thunberg, or other things that happen? It's constantly changing. I live in a pretty small village in southern Bavaria, almost Austria, and there are these rallies, 500 people, Fridays for Future. That's incredible. Whatever you think, like about the whole rhetoric, so this has a real impact. I think it has an impact. And other things, like since I'm writing about these issues, like what political scientists call salience. So until 2-3 years ago, again, Bavaria, conservative government, they thought like on the top of the agenda is migration. But now it's down totally, you know? I mean, it's still in Europe, it's big, but they say it's climate change or education and rents. Yeah. Now we want to be different. That's yeah. Anyway, so that's the beauty of, I think, liberal democracy. So the agenda is not set forever, and social movements also make an impact.
Hey, my name is Nasir. I'm from Bangladesh. So my question is, what is the limitation of tolerance? How much should we tolerate, and how long should we tolerate? I mean, we talked about hate speech here. I mean, maybe some people are angry, some people are can't tolerate more, and they're just giving their speech on, let's see, on Facebook somewhere. And shall we consider it as hate speech? Shall we consider it as at a hate speech? Like I'm so tired. Like I can take it more. So I mean, my question is, how long should we tolerate, and how much should we tolerate? I mean, is there any limitation of tolerance?
And this simple answer to this question is, the question is it hate speech or not? If it's hate speech, it should not be tolerated.
No.
So the debate is like, we have certain, people voice their anger, which is fine, but is this a criminal offense? And that's something we can only discuss once we discuss certain utterances, So, but I would not say like, are there limits to the kind of hate speech we allow? This would be not my view. I mean, obviously there are limits to toleration, but the whole debate was like, this cannot be discussed in the abstract. Okay. I think that's maybe the main finding today. In this general way, who would say no? Although I gave examples, we could say like, there's no limit to, we can allow all kinds of religious creeds. There's no limit. And I gave another couple of other obvious examples where actually we live in a society that becomes more and more tolerant, and I see nothing bad in that, But then, of course, discussion always comes back to hate speech, to aggression, and there should be limits. Those limits were defined by other scholars like Jeremy Waldron. And usually people use terms like dignity or the standing of people in society. Once this threshold is crossed, the law should intervene, in my view, at least. But again, Arpad, when we talk, he said like, well, the Constitution, but the American Constitution says something else. It's much more, in a certain way, it's more liberal, if you want to use this term, but I would say that's a misguided way of understanding liberalism, in my view. Being European, to the core. Defending European values.
Very shortly. So, freedom of expression, as it was conceived when it was first developed and debated, was something that happened among individuals who behaved in a certain way. Now, and this is important to remember, because it was just not conceivable that one would admit freedom of expression coming from somebody who has the intention of, you know, talking behind your back or illustrating ways in which to destroy your body publicly, etc., etc. That was just not on the table. So a little bit of this question about where intransigence stops and toleration starts has to do with what are the unarticulated background assumptions we have when we say that we allow speech of a certain kind. And these background assumptions, they might be changing, and that is part of the conversation we're having on why it becomes so hard to know where to set the limits, I think.
Thank you.
You said there are limits to the tolerance. And who is then to decide where the limits are? For example, you take the beach in France. The lady with the Muslim clothes, I think you think we should be tolerant and let her have the Muslim clothes. Imagine a person would come down with a Nazi uniform. Should we be tolerant and let that person go to swim in a Nazi uniform? Or is that against your limit? And how can you define what is the limit?
I mean, who was that prince in England? Prince Harry? So it's legal in Britain, but it didn't go down well with the British public. So there are different ways of responding. I mean, in Germany, it's very clear it's illegal. Okay?
But I'm not talking about the legal differences. I'm talking about the tolerance, the cultural tolerance. Because you can make everything illegal. You can make a burqa illegal. You can make a bikini illegal. You can say everyone has to swim naked. Not what is legal. What is, from your perspective, why do you tolerate a burkini and not the Nazi uniform? Who is to decide what is okay or not?
I mean, the short answer, I mean, the Nazi, I don't know. I think, first of all, it's not easy. I think this French case, for example, it's not easy to completely separate this from legal debates, because there were court cases. Okay, so those who have a certain moral view, they actually sue the city of Nice, and then there were rallies. That's not answering your question. I think the main reason, I think Germany is not the only country where Nazi symbols are illegal. Why is that? Because many people take offense, you know, and maybe in 100 years from now we have a different situation. And people have actually made this argument, you know. At some point in Germany or Austria, I don't know whether there are other countries where this has been prohibited. It has been prohibited for this reason. You know, there's a growing Jewish community in Germany, many Jews from Russia, but also all kinds of, you know, that's what my argument again. This would be taken as an attack on the very standing of many other fellow citizens in Germany. These symbols. I would make the point that with time passing, at some point people with wearing Nazi swastikas, they will be looked at like people who deny, who basically say the earth is flat, or who make other crazy statements. But I think for this and the next generation, for the reasons I said, I think it's considered to be an attack on the very standing of many of our citizens, not just Jewish citizens. Whereas the burkini, you know, is different.
Just one more question then, because if you go after the majority, let's say a lot of people get offended, you said.
Yeah.
So
Offended.
we have, for example, in Malmö, we have a lot of Muslim immigrants. Does it mean if they get offended by the Star of David, we should not allow people to go around with the Star of David or a kippah on their head, because it offends a lot of Muslim people?
No, I would argue that there has to be religious liberty, and people have to wear their religious attire as they see fit, Jews, Muslims, and everyone else. And there were also cases in Germany where Muslims and also others attacked rabbis and these are cases, and that's a criminal offense, has to be persecuted. So just the feeling, but Nazi, the Holocaust, that's a bit more than just a feeling. That was like pretty massive, and it has shaped the identity of the entire nation. That's different from taking an offense in, a particular symbol. By the way, it's also a European issue. Imagine this would be allowed in Germany, and people start marching like in Charlottesville. In the United States, it's legal.
My name is Nadja Gruberg. I'm thinking of many women that might be offended by women that have to cover their hair, because in Sweden, it was also like that once upon a time, like my grandmother, my mother's generation, grandmother's mothers,
I know.
that they had to cover their hair. They couldn't have long hair like I had at my age or if they were married, because it was a sign of being a bad woman, a whore. So seeing women covered up all can upset me a lot, even because it reminds me of women's oppression in my own country and in my mother's and grandmother's generation. And that is an oppression of women being able to be human beings as equal as men in our society. And women have been banished in the church, and there have been, when you talk about that is something special about the Shoah, the Holocaust, women oppression is something that goes back centuries and many long, it's way long back. So I think sometimes the feelings that emerge when so many women go around covered has to do with remembrance on a very deep level, and it's like Merleau-Ponty talks about, that it has to do with our bodies. It's imprinted in our bodies when we move in a society and we see each other and meet each other.
I mean, the short answer is tolerance is about, emotional self-control. That was my argument. Not give in to the urge. I mean, you have all the right on earth to reject and to have these associations, but you have no right to ban something that reminds you of something. There was a campaign. I'm a little older. In the 80s, there was a campaign by feminists against miniskirts. Yeah, Alice Schwarzer in Hamburg. She basically campaigned against women dressing up sexy, and it has had a certain value, but I mean, you can't start banning everything just because people think like they look like a whore. By the way, whores deserve all the tolerance.
But
they also deserve tolerance.
Excuse me for interrupting you.
Yeah.
When it comes to women's issues, it's always something that you can't stop banning it. I'm not talking about, you were talking about that we have to look closely at what are the behind, what is behind when we speak about tolerance and intolerance, empathy or sympathy. Empathy and sympathy is quite different, I would say.
Yes,
two quite
very
different
true.
things.
Good point.
So this is only what I wanted to put into this discussion, that we have to look very closely at the intolerance or the strong emotions that are evoked by women being covered up more or less the way they are. There are many different. We have to look closely at the history. Why is that? It's not that people are just emotional. It's a history in our country and in many countries. And it's rooted in the oppression of women's ability to live freely and move freely in a patriarchal country, a world.
Okay.
Well, you can hear what I say, everybody? Yeah, I want to go back to this kind of discussion about limitation of tolerance, and also who is going to decide what is what could be tolerated and what not. You know, the comparison between Nazi uniform and Muslim clothing is a little bit awkward, because in Germany the case is also historical. We know everybody about Second World War, Nazi movement, and all the problems it has caused. And still in Germany, there are still people living from that time. I was born in Austria, in Vienna, 1944. I'm still alive here. I can tell you stories about my grandfather, my uncle, whatever, my family. And I know many people, many of my friends in the same age. We still have that problem in ourselves, and we have to struggle with that. We have to work with it. We have to come over it, and every day we have to. I mean, if you live in Sweden, for instance, this country, I think there's hardly a day where you are not going to be reminded what happened in the Second World War, more or less. If you go to schools, school books, movies, everything like that. So I think. With Muslim clothing, that is a little bit more contemporary, I must say. That's a problem we have to deal with today. The German problem we have dealt, we have learned, and we have overcome it. I think Germany is great. I mean, you have been working quite a lot to open all the archives and all the documentation, and the Austrians less, but the Germans did so. So I think because of the historical impact. So I think that, and also setting a line. Where's the red line? Nazis, it can happen again. You still have the house of the birthhouse of Hitler in Austria.
I have another. May I answer?
Yeah.
I mean, just again, because this swastika thing, you know, I think there's some evidence, like in, let's say Germany, you know, if some guy, and there are actually these music festivals sometimes, so you do have neo-Nazis wearing and hoping not to get caught, and it's a pretty clear-cut case, you know. Nobody walks around with this who's not a neo-Nazi, okay? And we know what they are up to, what they think. It's even among like the far right, you know, they don't use these symbols. That will be the disanalogy to Muslims, you know. I have students, you know, and there's such a broad range of why women dress the way, and actually how they wear things. And there's this fashion element, so it's so much more complicated. Actually, there have been studies also, you know, where you know, feminist scholars talk to women and find out. So why do you wear this? Don't you think it's awkward? What do you think people? How do people respond? And so there's actually a research area. That's not the case with people who would look like Nazis, you know. So that will be my response. So in some cases, some research is really important. So why do people dress the way they dress, and what does it mean, you know? Yeah, but just again, like my last point, Timothy Garton Ash, of the English journalist and writer, he visited us at the KWI in Essen a while ago. He's been working on free speech, and he said, like, I think free speech should include, you know, first of all, publishing Hitler's Mein Kampf, which has happened actually. There's a critical edition. And I think he also included certain dresses and things, and you know, the audience in Germany said, no, not really. We don't go that way. So, but there are people who make this argument, like, you know, perfectly nice, liberal, you know. They say, like, yeah, in England, yes, but not in Germany.
Okay, so I think that you're perfectly right on the context dependency that we have to stress. That these things, they will vary and they will have different meanings in different contexts. So one has to be attentive to that. And I think it's also very important to be attentive to the narrative dimension of these things, about not only the reasons publicly given, but also the stories that lie behind why we would want one thing rather than another. Where does the red line go? And so I think there's value in hearing the narratives, not merely airing the arguments, because arguments are always shaped by people having a particular voice in argumentation, right? And that is not necessarily the voices we need to hear. We also need to hear the voices of those who experience it, but did not work on the crafting of the arguments. So I think the narratives are important to come to the fore. And then I want to say something very shortly about the law and morality here, because that's where I think a lot of critical things comes down to. Now, we have to be clear about the fact that we can disapprove in various ways, right? Now, disapproving with the use of the law, which means including the violence of the state, is the strongest way in which we can ban things, right? But it's not necessarily the most effective one. So social disapproval can sometimes be much harsher than the law, right? So I just flew in from Rome. The Italian constitution bans the fascist party since the war. That has not prohibited fascism in Italy in any way soever. Right. So it is not true that the fact that you use the strongest force of the law, that you always obtain the best of results. So you have to be attentive, I think, to the social attitudes in society, because those are somehow the signs, the signum prognosticum of where your society is heading. So in that sense, we have to be a little bit careful about when we use the law, how we use the law, and what signs are there out there in society about what we think is things that we should socially disapprove of, and in which ways we should express that social disapproval.
Yes.
A final question, all for you.
I just find that all of these discussions around recognition or tolerance and what should be prohibited and what should be regulated by social pressure or social norms, a lot of things comes down to norms and values and the idea of the ideal society that we feel we would like to live in, and also who is invited to who. Because if we recognize or tolerate a difference from, for instance, another culture or another country, that means that we as a host sort of recognizes that difference, and it takes some kind of mutual tolerance also from both parties to accept the rules of the game, so to speak, spelregler in Swedish, in this territory that we're acting on. But a lot of things, once again, comes down to a common idea of the ideal society that we would like to shape together with values and norms. And for that, it takes good leadership. And I think also that the polarized society that we see today, with the fast-paced changes and in both tech and migrations and different expressions, that takes a very good leadership to communicate the values that we find that we can gather around. And then tolerance and recognition will be, I think, much easier to deal with. The polarities, when we don't really understand the norms or the values that we're supposed to align to, makes it so much more difficult. And that's when, as the gentleman here said, we start tearing down instead of gradually building up something. I just wonder if you have any comments on that.
I couldn't say that better myself.
I think that's a great final word, almost. Very true. Yeah.
In that case, I would like to thank you very much.
Thank you.